What's up, everybody? John TheMorgile here, clocking in for another cosmological neutering session. Indeed, I have a strong aversion to massive imaginary balls. This video was intended to be relatively brief, but you know me, it covers a topic which remains a mystery to science, even though they hate to admit it. My original draft was going to be about 30 minutes, but I had to add some backstory or fundamental premises or describe some fundamental premises for people to understand before proceeding with the, you know, crux of the presentation or study, whatever you want to call it. Uh, this video is intended to be a comparative examination of a particular astronomical phenomenon, specifically the 75-year cycle of Halleys Comet, and how this observable anomaly of the heavens doesn't make any sense whatsoever when humoring the heliocentric model. Just as a really odd side note to kick off this show, I remember growing up, the comet was pronounced by everybody as Haley's Comet. However, the current accepted pronunciation is to be said like Valley's Comet, so like Halley's Comet. Furthermore, there are accounts that the last name of the dude was actually pronounced Hawley by the man himself. Sadly, he has no living descendants or relatives to confirm the actual pronunciation of his name, and audio recordings wouldn't have been invented for another 100+ years after Edmund Halley's death. Now, I'm not a believer in the so-called Mandela effect, starting with Mandela himself, going across the board to everything except for one, which was the Luke, I am your father bit from Star Wars. I seem to remember one of my anal retentive teachers telling me in the past that everyone mispronounces Halley's Comet, but I can't swear to that. It seems like just a very vague memory. So for anyone out there who is into the Mandela effect, as it is interesting whether or not it's true, although were it true, it would of course be far more interesting. But this may be another one for proponents of the Mandela effect theory that you could, poll people on, is the pronunciation of the comet that comes around every 75 years. Last came in 1985. Is it Haley's or Halley's or Hawley's Comet? I always thought it was Haley's, but anyway, I wasn't born until the 80s, and I do remember growing up that tons of celebrities tried for decades to get Mandela freed, and I clearly remember him being freed from prison in 1990 as I was 9 years old and it was on the news for weeks. Everyone I know remembers that he got freed after decades as an old man, and people are now claiming that he was actually killed in some other alternate universe timeline or whatever, which only certain people can remember that part of it, which is kind of freaky, kind of weird to think about. But anyway, this video is about science, not conspiracy theory, but I just want to throw that out there because something like the Mandela effect is attractive and intriguing to the adventurous mind. Given a 0.1% chance of time travel being invented at any point in the future, then time travel would necessarily technically exist throughout the whole of time, and minor changes in the past could result in major changes in the future instantaneously without anyone really noticing it. My only problem with the Mandela effect theory is the fact that all of the instances appear to be minor changes in the scripts of movies and other such bubblegum pop culture sort of trivial media. For a final point on this before we get back on point, if I could travel through time, I would give myself the winning numbers to the Powerball jackpot for a certain day when someone was going to lose anyway, so that nobody's harmed by my action. I would do this one single time and then hide the time machine where it could never be found, perhaps even destroy it, as it's too frightening a thing to think of what would happen were humanity to actually be able to travel back in time to change the past. If such a technology did exist at any point in the future, again, it would necessarily exist in the present and the past, and we'd suddenly see a world full of never-ending cities, McDonald's everywhere, or like a super police state where every restaurant is called Taco Bell, kind of like in that Stallone Snipes movie Demolition Man.
And my reward is dinner and dancing at Taco Bell. I mean, hey, I like Mexican food, but come on.
Your tone is quasi-facetious, but you do not realize that Taco Bell was the only restaurant to survive the franchise wars.
So?
So? Now all restaurants are Taco Bell.
No way.
The only difference is we would not have any recollection of the previous history, since every moment in history leading up to that point before our birth would have changed, along with everyone's memories of the events. So I suppose I'm suggesting that even if the Mandela effect were a real thing, we'd never know it, and people would have no possible way of remembering alternate pasts. And I really don't see George Lucas traveling back in time to rewrite the father and son moment for Vader and Luke. So it must have been a mass misunderstanding of James Earl Jones. I mean, he was wearing a mask, although he does have one of the most, resounding, understandable voices ever. But really, if you had the time machine, why would you go back and change trivial, insignificant things like the spelling of Berenstain Bears, for example? Anyway, just thought it was an interesting side note. I'm going to call it Halleys Comet. If you want to correct me and call it Halleys Comet or Halley's Comet, go right ahead. I'm going to call it Halleys Comet. But the topic of comets comes up occasionally on different flat Earth, round Earth, globe Earth conversations, and it's often used as a proof somehow of a spherical Earth. So it's important to understand how they are explained, or comets are explained by mainstream physics, and compare that to a realistic view of the universe, which is of course a central stationary flat Earth as the primary dominant central body of the known universe. Not a heliocentric universe. Sorry, globbers. Many globbers will claim that comets somehow prove a heliocentric cosmology, while the phenomenon is truly not explained adequately by mainstream science using the accepted model with gravity as the sort of prevailing force, in the whole thing. Halleys Comet is probably the most well-known of all, and many of us watching this video, and me personally, had a chance to witness Halleys Comet in our lifetimes. I was about 4 years old when it last came through our realm, so I very vaguely remember my parents bringing me out to see it when I was really young. It certainly was not as exciting or memorable as, say, when I was 3, the 4th of July, or when I was 4, the 4th of July, in terms of dazzling eye candy. But I suppose it's difficult for a toddler to appreciate the occurrence of a phenomenon that only occurs once every 75 years, and is sort of a scientific mystery, really. Now, given the electromagnetic realm that we truly live in, it's no surprise to me to see cyclical heavenly anomalies which seem to mystify scientists and stargazers, theoretical physics, and even some actual scientists. Now, for Halleys Comet to come and go in such bizarre, confounding, extremely elliptical orbital patterns like clockwork, the explanations are inadequate at best in the heliocentric model, the exposure of which is the primary focus of this video. Now, I don't claim to have a demonstrable, verifiable explanation for the phenomenon of comets, but again, neither does the heliocentric model, which we'll show in a moment. But I do want to point out that the heliocentric model is the prevailing, commonly accepted model, which has had, hundreds and hundreds of years to hone their theories and place those theories into textbooks. Anyway, I do have my theories about comets, which I may briefly mention if I have time in this video, but we simply don't have enough realistic study or experimentation slash extrapolation of the known data related to Halley's Comet to understand exactly what's going on during the majority of its trajectory when it's not visible from the Earth. All of the data we do have is meticulously and painstakingly assumed and estimated to fit within the framework of the heliocentric cosmology. To me, it's imperative that we scrutinize the accepted explanation of the phenomenon to show how ridiculous the heliocentric logic truly is. Halley's Comet approaches the Sun every 75 or 76 years. Its visits have apparently been recorded as early as 467 BC, but it was allegedly discovered and documented as a repeating interloper into our inner solar system, or a comet, in 1758. Now, in terms of modern discovery, it was predicted to return in 1758 by an English astronomer, Edmund Halley, or Haley, or Halley. In 1758, he predicted its return, although his predicted discovery wasn't realized until after his death, so that's sort of sad. He had noticed an historical pattern of a cosmic intruder approaching the inner solar system and approaching the Sun in 1531, 1607, and 1682, in an interval of 76, 75, and then hence predicted and realized again 76 years later as predicted. Halley concluded that the three historical celestial anomalies were actually the same comet returning over and over again, and predicted successfully that the comet would come again in 1758. Now, it's claimed that Halley's orbital plane, the comet, its orbital plane, not the guy, is offset to the ecliptic, or the Earth's orbital path, by about 18 degrees. Now, its furthest divergence from the ecliptic is claimed to be about 10 astronomical units. Again, astronomical units, or AU, are the hypothetical radius of the Earth's orbit around the Sun in the heliocentric model. So whenever you refer to AU, or astronomical units, it's about 93 million miles. You can probably round it up to 100 million miles, but 1 AU equals 93 million miles. So for Halley's Comet's divergence from the ecliptic, being 10 AU, is totaling up to just shy of 1 billion miles, or 930 million miles, divergent from the ecliptic on the so-called southern portion of the comet's trajectory, or its aphelion, where it's furthest from the Sun. Now again, we're talking nearly 1 billion miles from the plane of the ecliptic on the southern side of the Earth's alleged orbital path, and is supposedly 3.3 billion miles from the Sun at that point, at its aphelion. Now, the heliocentric model purports that when Halley's Comet gets very close to the Sun, it supposedly pops over onto the northern side of the ecliptic for just a few months, reaching about 18 million miles north of the ecliptic at its peak position north of the ecliptic, at its closest to the Sun, approximately 56 million miles from the Sun, which again, it's at its closest point in its alleged trajectory, or perihelion. Now, at the point that the comet allegedly goes around the back of the Sun, it performs a mind-boggling acceleration from one extreme velocity to an opposite extreme velocity over the course of just a few months, thanks to the Sun's rather convenient and sort of counterintuitive display of so-called solar gravity, which powers and steers the comet perfectly on course for its next encounter, nearly a century later, billions of miles in space away from the previous encounter, considering the conflicting motions of the galaxy and the Sun and the comet in the heliocentric model, of course. Before continuing, I must comment on inertia applied to a body as small and low density to Halley's Comet, as it's whipped around the Sun, accelerated to nearly 150,000 miles an hour. the amount of so-called G-forces on an object traveling so close to the sun, making such a sharp turn and abrupt acceleration in the opposite direction as its original path of travel, should rip the comet split in half, as such a small, low-density body does not have the mass to counterbalance the immense centripetal forces theoretically applied to it by the gravitational pull of the sun, which is another big issue that we may touch on a bit later. But after its convenient, unbelievable, abrupt change in velocity and acceleration to 144,000 miles in the opposite direction, while apparently excused from the laws of inertia as it flirts with the allegedly supermassive sun comparatively, the comet again heads away from the sun at an 18-degree angle south of the ecliptic, on its way back out to the furthest reaches of the solar system to remain out of sight for another 75 years. Now, the most distant point of Halleys Comet, or the aphelion, is claimed to be 35 astronomical units, or 35 times further from the Sun compared to the Earth. So we're talking 3.255 billion miles, which is actually very close to the average distance from Pluto to the Sun, again according to the heliocentric model, which is Pluto is about 3.6 billion miles on average away from the Sun. So this means Halleys Comet allegedly travels about 92% of the distance to Pluto's alleged average distance to the Sun during Halleys aphelion. Now, think about that for a moment. At its most distant point from the Sun, the teeny tiny, low density, which we'll get into, Halleys Comet, is alleged to be roughly as distant as Pluto, which allegedly has a volume of 1.5 billion cubic miles, that's Pluto, with an average density of 1.88 grams per cubic centimeter. Now remember these numbers because they play a huge role in so-called theoretical gravitational relationships, so just keep the numbers in mind. And again, Pluto has a purported volume of 1.5 billion cubic miles and an average density of 1.88 grams per cubic centimeter. Now, the mass of Pluto is supposedly what allows it to maintain a balanced orbit with the Sun, assuming the imagination verse governed by gravity, space-time, chance, coincidence, and relativity, and all that nonsense, right? Consider this: if you were to remove 99% of Pluto's mass, the object would theoretically lose its gravitational connection with the Sun and would begin to drift further and further away from the Sun and out into the far reaches of outer space, as the alleged gravitational relationship between two celestial bodies is fundamentally related to proximity of the two objects, as well as the volume and the density of the two objects. Now, although Pluto is alleged to be extremely small and of low density compared to the other solid planets, it's extremely massive and dense compared to Halleys Comet, as we'll soon see. What's so comical about this particular comet is that at its nearest to the Sun, Halleys supposedly gets a mere 56 million miles from the Sun, which is less than half the distance of the Sun compared to Venus. Furthermore, it's claimed that the object is moving at its fastest when it's nearest the Sun, getting, sort of a boost up to around 40 miles per second, or 144,000 miles an hour, which is, by the way, more than double the alleged orbital velocity of the Earth. Halleys Comet is claimed to have a mean diameter of 11 kilometers, hence an approximate area of about 95 square kilometers, or about 37 square miles. This would approximate the volume at around 697 cubic kilometers, or about 167 cubic miles, according to mainstream science. These are just approximations. Now, just to point out an important factor, were we to assume a flat Earth model, these figures would necessarily be way off. since the sun is much closer than 93 million miles away in reality, meaning the assumed size and speed of the comet must be far lesser than claimed, as the accepted values and sizes and velocity are bloated extrapolations based on the absurd theoretical distance to and size of the sun in the heliocentric model. Now, I don't want to go too deep into a flat Earth examination of the phenomenon of Halley's Comet, but rather, more importantly, to keep the fact in the back of your mind that all of the figures used will be based on the accepted heliocentric values. Now, I want to remind the viewer that the point of science is to challenge accepted explanations of nature, and it's important to consider alternative theorem for cyclical comets, which allegedly travel from the far reaches of the solar system right to the near center of the inner solar system, which is an extremely confounding observation indeed, especially adhering strictly to a globe-Earth heliocentric paradigm. I've already mentioned the alleged volume and density of Pluto, which we'll compare to that of Halley's Comet for logical examination, and how orbital mechanics could not possibly allow for such a bizarre occurrence as a comet that nearly misses the sun like clockwork every 75.5 years and escapes the enormous gravitational pull of the sun to reach the outer edge of the solar system, only to somehow be compelled to find its way back to the sun 75 years later with no secondary source of motive power, no sort of intelligent guidance during its 3.3 billion mile one way, so 6.6 billion mile journey round trip. The only motive power and intelligent guidance of this thing is the random chaotic gravity of the sun. Now, Halley's Comet supposedly has a density of about 1 gram per cubic centimeter based on a range of estimates spanning 0.2 to 1.5 grams per cubic centimeter, a range of error of 750% comparatively. This sort of goes without saying, but that isn't exactly a precise science by any stretch. Instead, it's exactly an average of wild guesses based on nothing more than conjecture and theory, since triangulating heavenly bodies is always done using spherical trig and unfathomable assumed astronomical units, as opposed to plane trigonometry, assuming rather short astronomical units. In any case, the maximum alleged density of the comet is less than that of Pluto, not to mention the volume of Pluto dwarfs the comet as a microscopic piece of dust, but we'll get into that in a minute. The volume of the comet, let alone Pluto, are indeed wild guesses based on assumptions. Nobody's ever gone to a comet and fetched up a piece of it to verify the density, right? Not even Bruce Willis. Furthermore, nobody has ever flown up to Halley's Comet, busted out their ruler stick, and measured the exact dimensions of the object, or, mysterious anomaly. However you want to look at the dimensions of Halley's Comet are mere conjecture without, actually going up there and measuring them. We can't base our measurements on faulty extrapolations of the size and distance of the sun. Estimating the size and distance of a celestial light is difficult, as there's no accurate frame of reference to base our units of measurement. As an example, on a very clear day, sometimes it's hard to tell whether a high-flying bird and a low-flying plane are at comparable altitudes, since we only have endless blue sky and no stationary familiar frame of reference to estimate the size and distance to each object accurately. Now, we rationally realize that the bird must be closer and smaller than the plane, since we can actually examine and measure both birds and planes. However, an object like a comet isn't exactly tangible so that we can measure and weigh it. The only reason the ancient Greeks claimed the ability to estimate the distance to the sun was because it casts an obvious shadow, which can theoretically be used to triangulate the position of the sun without too much guesswork involved when we're talking about the equinox and 2 points which are known to be on the same meridian line. At one point, the sun is directly overhead, casting no shadow at high noon, allegedly creating the square of a right triangle. At the same time, another point, say hundreds of miles distant upon the same meridian, will see the same sun shadows at the same time, cast as a stretched acute shadow angle, which can be used to estimate the distance to the sun, using trigonometry. So it was assumed that by taking these readings we could calculate the distance to the sun. However, there are two major variables in this equation which are unknown, and both must be tested. Now, I don't want to get too far off the beaten path with this backstory involving triangulation of the sun because a lot of people are already aware of it, but the sun is a major metric for the entire system, which varies by nearly 100 million miles in distance comparatively in either model. One big problem with this entire line of reasoning is found among the multiple assumed premises which are unproven and faulty at best when examining the heliocentric model. The first premise being that all sunlight is coming towards the Earth uniformly in parallel lines across the whole world. Now, this is only a half-truth or a local truth extrapolated fallaciously or naively and then applied to the macro level using flawed logic and confirmation bias back when people were first testing the hypothesis of a spherical Earth and trying to determine the distance to the sun. And I might add that they did not have any, high altitude capabilities. All they had was theory. So, yes indeed, to a single observer, all of the shadows cast by the sun will appear to cast parallel line shadows everywhere in sight. However, 500 miles east of said observer at the same time, another observer would also experience the same thing, parallel, shadows cast by the sun everywhere, all emanating in parallel lines apparently from the sun. The problem is, these two sets of shadows would be aligned to different parallels relative to the previous shadow 500 miles west, indicating a nearby sun casting convergent shadows. The sun for each observer, separated by 500 miles along a single line of longitude, would be subjective, and the shadows cast by the sun being convergent can be interpreted in one of two ways. So there are two ways to interpret this data regarding the sun shadows, and I'll get to the point about comets, I promise. It's important that we start this with a clear understanding of how we get such drastically differing estimated distances and sizes of the sun comparing flat Earth with globe Earth. So, given the apparent direction and azimuth determined by either sun shadows or solar clocks or other instrumentation such as sextants, an observer can either A, assume a flat Earth with a local relatively small sun, or B, assume a spherical Earth with an extremely large, extremely distant sun. And we'll look quickly at both of these examples of applied trigonometry. This is an important point to understand before we move on. Now, we'll start with A and assume the flat Earth with a local sun, as it seems to be from a cursory observational common sense analysis. Sunlight is emerging from a local point, meaning it's not very distant, hence not very large compared to the Earth. Ergo, the path of all sunlight can be traced back to a single point of convergence, which always leads back to the apparent sun. Now, the apparent sun is of course subjective, depending on the observer's position, altitude, atmospheric conditions, etc., making it difficult to triangulate on a subjective optical illusion in either model. At the same time, obvious examples of convergent sun rays are explained away by the theory of crepuscular rays, which is an absurd misapplication of the visual operation of perspective in order to trick people. If the sun is indeed local, that would instantly disprove the heliocentric model by default. Ergo, plainly observed convergent sun rays is a true crisis to overzealous cult members of the religion of scientism, And so dogmatic theories are supplanted into the canon, scientific record, as factual to try and avoid people looking into this phenomenon any further than Google convergent sun rays, find crepuscular rays, end research and observation. Conclusion has been made by the popular definition of research and experiment, which amounts to finding something on Google and verifying it on Wikipedia. Case closed, the Earth is a globe. That is, typically how most people do their research anymore. Of course, none of you guys watching, obviously. I'm talking about the majority of bona fide scientists. This is why we have so many irrational explanations patching together the heliocentric model. Such fiction must be fabricated, stitched up and patched together with assertive conjecture and even lies in order to mitigate all of these contradictions and physical impossibilities galore entailed in the heliocentric model. Claiming that sunlight is not really converging at a point, it's merely the illusion of perspective causing this optical phenomenon, which is a cop-out and a fallacious argument. Of course, many examples of crepuscular rays are obviously not aligned to the expected angles where perspective actually causing parallel sunbeams to apparently converge. The fact is, sunlight only appears to cast parallel shadows on a local level, which is a subjective phenomenon upon a plane with atmosplane. Now, on a macro scale, this convergence of sun rays or sun shadows is far too large for us to see within our tiny field of view, just as the curvature would be. Our field of view, or our horizon, is a radius of about 3.5 miles if standing 6 foot tall, without any geological obstructions like hills, mountains, or trees. Furthermore, each observer is standing upon the ground with our equidistant bubble of particulates and vapors surrounding us, bending and perturbing light waves until they eventually reach our eye. Anyway, it takes a certain phenomenon to notice firsthand the convergent nature of sun rays, but high-altitude weather balloon footage easily shows on the macro level that the sun is indeed local, and much, much closer than we've been led to believe. Convergent sun rays and convergent shadows are indeed caused by a relatively local sun shining upon a flat Earth, where the atmosphere and natural geological electromagnetic fields act as an excellent conductor or medium to perpetuate visible spectrum light waves. In other words, it is not the curvature of the Earth creating an illusion of convergent sun rays from a massive, distant sun casting a parallel wall of light nearly 1 million miles in diameter across 1 billion miles of theoretical space-time to pass through our natural electromagnetic barrier and radiation barrier, then refract and diffuse as it filters through varying density and temperature layers of gases of our atmosphere, causing all sorts of refraction and distortion of the original source light, which finally meets our eye. Now, it's human nature to believe that since you can point to the sun and that's where it is, unfortunately this isn't the case. And what you're pointing to is an apparent sun, which would be in a different place according to an observer far removed from your position, say 500 miles west. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the atmosphere and other natural conditions affect how light paths alter and even become magnified as through a lens by our atmosphere. Another natural phenomenon such as geological electromagnetic fields, which also perturb light, render us extremely biased observers akin to an ant living inside of a kaleidoscope, making interpretations and extrapolations of the light waves to triangulate upon the source of light, sort of a fool's errand, especially when using the technique of the ancient Greeks, which start with the assumption that the Earth is a sphere to end with the conclusion that the Earth is a sphere. all shadows cast by the apparent sun will converge to a point, more or less, because the sun is near and the earth is a plane, meaning the fundamental assumption used by the ancient Greeks and modern imaginative theorists to triangulate the sun was a false assumption. That assumption was, of course, that the earth was a sphere. There's plenty of video and photographic evidence showing convergent sun rays that are not explained by or aligned to the visual operation of perspective. Also, from certain vantage points at the right time, you can clearly see hot spots directly beneath the sun from the vantage point of about 100,000 foot high from a weather balloon. Since the atmosphere plane is far less dense when you reach altitudes of 100,000 feet, I feel it's safe to assume we have a much clearer picture of where the actual sun is, and if we could coordinate multiple simultaneous balloon launches across the country or across the world, it would become very obvious that the sun and moon are not extremely distant, relatively massive objects, but instead are local phenomenon beholden to the excellently balanced static plane Earth. And I believe that such a experiment done with multiple simultaneous weather balloons could triangulate the position of celestial bodies much better than we can on the ground. Now, high altitude vantage points were not available to the ancient theorists who built our paradigm thousands of years ago. Sure, they could get on top of a mountain, but they couldn't get 100,000 feet in the air and bring back footage. We have airplanes, not air curves, sorry, but airplanes, high altitude weather balloons, digital cameras, computers, large vacuum chambers, precision machining capabilities, and on and on and on. None such luxuries were afforded to the philosophers of ancient times, yet we're supposed to take their word for things that we can obviously see for ourselves, where they were drastically mistaken in their assumptions. Now, all of this and more proves the apparent sun is much, much closer than we've been led to believe, and necessarily much smaller as well. We can also point to the recent Go Fast rocket launch where the moon was visible in a few of the frames, when technically the moon should have been on the opposite side of the spherical world over Australia at that point. So you're shortly going to hear two noises in succession. The first noise is the de-spinning mechanism of the rocket, and the second noise is the rocket releasing or jettisoning its primary boost stage. In terms of the first noise, or the de-spin mechanism, one of the ways this is achieved is by what's called a yo-yo de-spin. And yo-yo de-spin mechanism is a device used to reduce the spin of rockets. It consists of two lengths of cable with weights on the ends. The cables are wrapped around the final stage, and in the manner of a double yo-yo. When the weights are released, the spin of the rocket flings them away from the spin axis. This transfers enough angular momentum to the weights to reduce the spin of the rocket to the desired value. And that second noise you just heard was not the rocket hitting the so-called dome. I seem to remember there being a magnetic de-spin mechanism available as another possibility for the de-spin, but anyway, here is where you can see the moon clearly when it should be on the opposite side of the spherical Earth. Now, I realize that that was a bit lengthy, but now I'll do a brief look at the other option B in terms of how we can process the same data to triangulate the sun and get a wildly different result. So B, you can assume the spherical Earth and triangulate the sun by erroneously assuming that all light waves are coming towards the spherical Earth in a near perfect parallel lines and uniformly striking the Earth at the same angle on the macro level, with an extremely distant and large sun. Now, by this logic, it must be the Earth itself which is bending within this bombardment of theoretical parallel light waves, creating an illusion of convergent sun rays, but only over great distances. Now, the only way that you can arrive at this conclusion is to assume the Earth is a sphere for argument's sake, to prove the distance to the Sun is 93 million miles away. Now, it's fine to use assumptions as the cornerstone variable to an entire equation or theory. However, at some point, such assumptions must be proven or falsified, or at least tested or pursued scientifically, which doesn't seem to be done in mainstream scientism when it deals with anything theoretical, globist, galactic model. All of that seems to be left unquestioned and just parroted by peer review. Now, instead, the cornerstone assumptions, which are never proven, continue to be considered as infallible permanent laws. Now, the assumptions are the unquestionable dogma of scientism, which must never be scrutinized beyond the point of simply accepting them hook, line, and sinker and extrapolating everything else from a falsely assumed fundamental premise. Either one of these examples just mentioned, A or B, show that mathematics do not determine reality, but math is merely a language to describe reality and make quantifiable predictions in the most logical terms possible. The problem is, reality does not strictly adhere to, or reality is not beholden to, our assumed mathematics, especially when the equations we're using are riddled with disproved, unknown assumptions as fundamental premises. In so many cases, the globe Earth storyline has applied assumed values to variables which massively affect the outcome of the equation and are never ever questioned or second guessed, although the distance to the Sun has ranged from a sparse few billion miles distant to over 100 million miles distant, back down to 93 million miles, according to the globus lie throughout its history, but that's another story. We've been forced to assume the spherical Earth, basing all of our cosmological understandings and physical extrapolations on this one assumption. Now, I think this goes without saying, but if your entire worldview is based upon a faulty understanding of the realm of reality, how much control or respect do you honestly think an average person has over their life? How easy is it to manipulate people with such fantastic, astronomical, absurd, rotund lies, which create instant doubt and incredulity towards the cosmology of all ancient religions, which are geocentric, flat, static Earth cosmologies? That's the ancient Hebrew, ancient Vedic cosmology, even the New Testament. They're flat Earth books, and even the Quran teaches a flat, stationary Earth. So this seems to be a pattern in most of the ancient religions. Now, this obvious divide between science and religion further leads a faithful person to question the validity of their respective holy book. If there's such a glaring flaw as the very shape and nature of the Earth in most of these religious books, I think this is a major motive for this lie to be perpetuated, to psychologically distance us or disconnect us from our Creator, drastically lowering our self-respect, as the entirety of human history and humanity is as insignificant as a single snowflake in the infinite imagination verse theory. If that's actually what everyone believes, then how can a single person's life make a difference in the grand scheme of things, assuming an infinite universe created by cosmic coincidence and the random soulless creator of all things, gravity? Life itself is a freak accident, according to the religion of scientism, putting us all along the same rank and file as an amoeba or maybe a virus, where nothing in reality holds any lasting meaning or permanent value. A personal path of chivalry or despotism will rationally seem to make no difference in the grand scheme of things to an average globber. The infinite coincidence verse theory can profoundly affect a person's ID and life choices subconsciously. I think it's a shame that false cosmology is taught in all schools based on theory, assumption, and egotism, along with the Copernican principle which dictates the world must never hold any special or central place in the so-called universe. Now, this is all well and good for theoretically testing hypotheses, but one day you must prove the myriad fundamental assumptions to complete the diligent ideal process of science. Now, if you've watched any of my or some of my previous videos so far, you'll know that the two primary proofs which must be demonstrated by globbers are inverse square curvature of the Earth's surface as a whole and axial rotation of the Earth. These are two fundamental exercises or experiments in geometry and physics, neither of which have ever been proven by anything other than circumstantial evidence, confirmation bias, and a stubborn refusal of science to reconsider said fundamental dogmas, even when physical evidence is presented which contradicts the unquestionable doctrines of their beloved spherical Earth, created by the god of atheism and scientism, aka gravity. On the other hand, the fact that the Earth is actually a stationary plane is self-evident to the honest observer. And if you've been following along with my research for the last year and a half, you'll understand the never-ending mountain of empirical evidence supporting this simple truth is so overwhelming. Once you have a fraction of the facts, any notion of a globe begins to seem extremely absurd. But this video isn't about proving flat Earth. Instead, I wanted to focus on the phenomenon of comets, Halleys Comet as the particular case study. Hopefully the background or setup information that I just gave wasn't too boring or lengthy to my regular viewers, but we must keep in mind there are new people finding this truth every day, so it's important to set up some fundamental understanding of the topic at hand, especially using the very heliocentric model which most people claim to represent. Once a globber truly understands the theorem which they're expected to believe, such as the supersonic spin at the equator, as one example, are beyond ridiculous, the rest of the transition away from the globe becomes less and less difficult. The most difficult part of this awakening is to just get people to simply look at the damned evidence objectively, skeptically, and with an open mind. So, as we've already covered, due to the unknown variables involved with the size and distance of the Sun, assumptions must be drawn to determine which equation to plug your data into. Again, in this case, the assumptions range from the Earth being a plane with a small local sun or a sphere with a large distant sun. There are simply too many assumptions involved, which brings me to the entire point of this sidetrack. Any assumptions about the size of Halleys Comet mentioned in this portion of the video series will be based on heliocentric assumptions, which must necessarily be way off from the truth, or the true flat Earth reality. At any rate, I'm only going to humor this phenomenon using heliocentric values and estimates to show how absurd the phenomenon of Halleys Comet truly is in the galactic imagination verse theory. Now, remember, if any of the explanations, or one of the explanations for natural observations such as comets, don't add up in the heliocentric model governed by gravity and chance, then the model must be revisited, scrutinized, and indeed bulldozed to the ground once one realizes the true extent of the misunderstandings and deceptions abound with the globe Earth hypothesis. Now, I've always been fascinated by mysterious anomalies such as comets since I was very young. Halleys Comet comes around only once per many, many years. In the case of Halleys Comet, it's about 75 or 76 years, grazing dangerously close to the Sun, but never crashing into the Sun. This raises a huge red flag for me, which I may get into later if necessary, time permitting. The problem is, proponents of the heliocentric model have had centuries to come up with theories to convince themselves they are true without the ability to test or verify the validity of the fundamental assumptions supporting the theories, which are finally supplanted into the scientific and historical records as known scientific facts or laws, then taught in all schools as known scientific facts since the beginning of modern history, possibly the beginning of time, who knows. Now, to quickly give you an understanding of a law and a theory and what the difference is, what goes up must come down is a law, gravity is a theory, which has been disproved. To give you an example of how quickly scientific history can change, prior to 1929, all scientists believed the so-called Milky Way galaxy was the only galaxy in the universe. One single man, a science fiction buff named Hubble, who was actually a Freemason and a Jesuit priest as well as a science fiction buff, convinced the entire world that there were billions of other galaxies in the so-called universe. Now, that was about 75 years ago when he began his promotion of this theory, and by the 1990s, the majority of people were subconsciously convinced that galaxies had been a part of ancient heliocentric cosmology for several thousand years. So again, please try to mind the differences between law and theory, and remember that theories in astrophysics are imagined explanations for natural observations which can never be proven, tested, or falsified, defining theoretical astrophysics as exactly pseudoscience. Now, in terms of Halleys Comet, even humoring the impossibility of orbital mechanics, which I've got a series playlist, I'll put a link in the description, for such a small, low-density object to perfectly orbit the Sun so closely without being sucked into the Sun's alleged gravitational pull or ripped apart by the inertia of such an object experiencing the unimaginable acceleration due to solar gravity as the comet approaches and rounds the Sun is quite an amazing feat. Now, you know how when you turn your car left really abruptly, everyone in the car leans to the right? Well, this is caused by inertia. Now, could you imagine traveling, say, 100,000 miles per hour down a theoretical straight highway, then suddenly making a very sharp parabolic turn while accelerating to 144,000 miles per hour to eventually begin traveling in the opposite direction to that of your original path of travel? I can assure you that your inertia inside that car would cause you to be pressed so hard against the outside edge of the turn, you would most certainly rip the door right off its hinges and fly off at a 90-degree angle to the axis of rotation. Inertia is completely overlooked when considering the mind-boggling speeds ascribed to Halleys Comet, as if the laws of inertia don't apply to objects accelerating through the Sun's imaginary gravitational field. Remember, orbit is achieved by the velocity of an object, such as Halleys Comet, naturally wanting to fly in a straight line through rectilinear spacetime. However, it is the centripetal force of the Sun's supposed gravity which keeps an object in orbit, meaning there must necessarily be a dynamic tension between the two objects. Now, by dynamic tension, what I mean is you can easily demonstrate this by anyone with two hands. Clasp your hands together, interlocking your fingers, and try to pull your arms apart without letting your fingers go. Now, don't hurt yourself, because as long as those two forces are equal, your hands will remain stationary, as the dynamic tension cancels itself out. Now, if you can juxtapose the idea of dynamic tension upon the relationship to the Sun and the comet, it would be like arm wrestling the Incredible Hulk. There would be no dynamic tension, there would be an imbalance of force, causing all sorts of stress on the comet due to inertia and centrifugal force being counterbalanced by the centripetal force of the Sun's gravity, which I would submit would be much, much greater than the centrifugal force of the comet. But that's just me. Uh, one force being the velocity of the comet, the other force being the so-called gravity of the sun, playing essentially a tug of war with one another. Given the constant, ever-changing velocity of the galaxy and sun itself, it's a wonder Halley's Comet doesn't crash into the sun, or even more likely, completely miss the sun by billions and billions of miles, which we'll touch on in a minute. Now, we may dive a little deeper into the inner portion of Halley's orbit, but the biggest problem for the heliocentric model concerning Halley's Comet is the far side of the comet's so-called orbit, where it's far south of the ecliptic, 3.3 billion miles away from the Sun. Now, during the orbital phase, when it's allegedly deep in outer space at its aphelion, billions of miles from the Sun, 3.3 billion miles, nearly a billion miles divergent from the ecliptic, which is the Earth's orbital path, and most of the objects orbiting the Sun allegedly adhere to the ecliptic more or less. But billions of miles from the Sun, nearly a billion miles divergent from the ecliptic, hauling ass through space-time in the opposite direction as the Sun itself, while the Sun flies around a parabolic curve encircling the theoretical Milky Way galaxy at about 483,000 miles per hour, with an orbital radius that's actually claimed to be unclear by modern science. However, they do claim the Sun has an orbital period of about 250 million years. This cycle has, of course, never been verified, as scientists have been observing the Sun's alleged galactic orbit for 0 million years, certainly not 250 million years. But doing some basic mathematics based on their allegations, we can estimate sort of naively the circumference of the Sun's alleged galactic orbit by multiplying the alleged speed of the Sun with the time it takes to make a lap. So we'll do 483,000 miles an hour times 24 hours in a day times 365 days in a year times 250 million year cycle equals over a quintillion miles. That's a 1 followed by 18 zeros in terms of an approximate circumference of the Sun's alleged galactic orbit. Of course, the galaxy is supposedly hurling through space in a direction contrary to the orbital plane of the Sun, around the galactic equator, which is contrary to the orbital plane of Halley's Comet around the Sun. So we've got all sorts of converging directions. You've got like the galactic equator going this way, you've got the Sun going this way as this goes up, and you've got Halley's Comet sort of going this way around the Sun as all that happens. So you have all sorts of conflicting directions and weird combinations of acceleration depending on the time of day, year, eon, etc. I'll mention quickly that this animation that you're watching shows the Sun to be stationary, which really is a bunch of shit. The Sun is not stationary. Again, as I showed in the previous couple of animations, it's supposedly hauling balls around the galactic center, as the galactic center hauls even faster than the Sun in some other direction. So the animation with Halley's Comet conveniently making this elliptical sort of pattern with a stationary Sun is all nice and neat and fine and dandy, but when you add all of the conflicting motions of the Sun and the galaxy into the mix theoretically, then this is where you have problems with orbital mechanics in general, and of course especially things like Halley's Comet in the heliocentric model. Now, to put this in its simplest terms, an object such as a comet being flung haphazardly away from the Sun out into the far reaches of the solar system, while the Sun travels 317 billion miles around a curve over a 75-year period, the theoretical axis being the galactic center, and again the math on that was 483,000 miles per hour times 24 hours in a day times 365 days in a year times 75 years equals 317 billion miles, which the Sun would have traveled around a curve from one visit of Halley's Comet to the next. And that isn't even considering the galactic motion or the galactic frame of reference, which I'll only mention briefly, as the point I'm proving is done so sufficiently using just the alleged trajectory and velocity of the Sun and the comet. Now, just to keep in mind, according to the absurd heliocentric model, most of the stars in the alleged galaxy are supposed to orbit the galactic plane, mostly adhering to the so-called galactic equator, just as most of the so-called planets are allegedly aligned, more or less, to within a few degrees of the ecliptic, which is Earth's alleged plane of orbit. Of course, the galaxy is traveling in a direction contrary to the Sun's plane of orbit, just as Halleys Comet is allegedly traveling upon an orbital plane misaligned to the Sun's plane of orbit, or parabolic path of orbit. Now, I've already done a series of videos proving how second or third generation satellite bodies, such as the Moon or the ISS, are physically impossible to occur in reality. So I won't get into all that, but if you're interested, I'll place a link and a card to my series playlist called Disproving Orbital Mechanics. With the major issues involved with orbital mechanics involving the Sun, planets, and moons set aside for this study, we've run into some fairly big problems for the heliocentric model when we simply consider Halleys Comet, objectively and skeptically, using the very numbers and assumptions that are used by modern theoretical astrophysicists. Much like any other body in so-called orbit, it's really difficult to understand how the puny, low-density comet isn't thrown off its perfectly cyclical trajectory upon a constant plane relative to the Sun's curved orbital path, while the galaxy and the Sun have traveled billions and billions and billions of miles over a 75-year period in varying relative velocities during such 75-year intervals. Yet, Halleys Comet somehow finds its way back to the Sun without crashing directly into the dead center of the Sun, or even more likely, totally missing the Sun by billions of miles. Then the comet is allegedly set off to its perfect velocity and trajectory to return 75 years later by a random, irrational, non-intellectually guided, highly unlikely whip around the Sun without being torn apart by the opposing forces of the Sun's extremely high gravity and the object's extremely small size and high velocity. Low velocity compared to the Sun, but high velocity compared to the Earth. Now, the end result of this extremely unlikely series of events in a random scenario is a comet that comes and goes like a finely tuned clock every 75 then 76 years. Now, this has never sat right with me, even as a globber toddler, my whole life, like many other facts of nature which don't seem to jive with the gravitational model of the solar system. Somehow, old faithful Halleys Comet manages to maintain her perfect plane of orbit round the Sun, offset to our ecliptic by 18 degrees, although the only propelling force and singular guiding force of the comet's 75-year journey to the edge of the solar system and back is the few months spent accelerating around the Sun, somehow returning to the Sun 75 years later after the Sun has traveled over 317 billion miles around a curve, and also traveled, along with the galaxy itself some billions of miles. In other words, it is this powerful theory of gravity which accelerates and guides the comet perfectly into its bizarre, nonsensical orbital path with mere coincidence and chance to repeatedly send the comet on this perfect cycle through the cosmos. Yet none of this acceleration is ever felt anywhere. This is all just very absurd to me. And I want to cover real quickly the variables affecting theoretical gravity, or gravitational pull, or gravitational relationship between two distant objects separated by a vacuum, are proximity, volume, and density. Right? So, for a quick description of the volume and density of the comet, we'll cover a few well-known elements to get an idea of what type of an object we're dealing with, strictly using the accepted heliocentric values. So, to put this in perspective, note that balsa wood, which is a very light wood, is about 0.17 grams per cubic centimeter. This means that balsa wood is either just slightly less dense than the comet, assuming the lowball estimate of Halleys Comet. On the other hand, balsa wood could be 1/8 or 12% of the density of Halleys Comet, so much less dense than Halleys Comet, using the highball estimate. In either case, the planet Pluto is definitely more dense at 1.88 grams per cubic centimeter than Halleys Comet, even assuming the highball estimate of the comet's density of 1.5 grams per cubic centimeter. Now, all of this is an approximate estimation based on accepted conjecture agreed upon by professional proponents of the heliocentric model, so I don't necessarily agree with these figures ascribed to Pluto or Halleys Comet, so please don't misquote me on any of this. I'm just doing an exercise to see how much sense the heliocentric model works. So, it's important to compare the attributes of the comet to familiar items to get an understanding of its properties according to the heliocentric model and things that we can relate to. For example, solid state water or ice, which weighs about 0.92 grams per cubic centimeter. And for argument's sake, and just to use good round numbers, we'll say that ice is 1 gram per cubic centimeter. To draw an easily understood comparison, which is accurate enough due to the extremely vast margin of error defining the average of wild guesses representing the density of Halleys Comet. A 10% rounding up of the density of ice is a drop in the bucket compared to the 750% increase from the lowball estimate of Halleys Comet density to the highball estimate. So it's safe to say that ice is about as dense as Halleys Comet. In fact, according to the ranges involved, Halleys Comet could be exactly as dense as frozen water, or it could really be 0.92 grams per cubic centimeter. But again, we'll just assume they're both 1 gram per cubic centimeter to make the exercise a bit less complex using good round numbers such as 1. Doesn't get much rounder than that, and it, something that we can all relate to. Now, to draw another comparison of something that's more dense that we can all relate to, a cubic centimeter of steel weighs about 8 grams per cubic centimeter, or about 8 times more dense than Halleys Comet, if we accept the average of wild guesses as the actual density of the comet to be about 1, as we just agreed to do a moment ago. Now, let me admit again, that for all intents and purposes, all of the aforementioned figures and following extrapolations plugged related to Pluto or Halleys Comet are averages of wild guesses which cannot be verified, categorizing this entire study as pseudoscience. But, like they say, when in Rome, even when theoretical physics approaches the realm of folly and conjecture, it's the ruling law of the land. But it has a weak point, and the weak point of accepted theoretical physics is the fact that it's all kinds of bullshit, although it's necessary to use the accepted assumptions to cast light upon the error involved. So I want to be clear, there are multiple values we could plug into any such theoretical equation involving the orbital relationship between Halley and the Sun, but for the sake of brevity, I will not go down each rabbit hole to consider multiple possibilities of Halleys Comet's density. Instead, I will merely mention and describe them so you understand what I mean. The 3 possibilities we could use to represent Halley's density, and there are actually probably millions of combinations that we could use, but I'll just mention 3. The lowest wild guessed estimate of Halleys Comet density as about 0.2 grams per cubic centimeter, slightly more dense than balsa wood, which is extremely light wood, sort of like cork. B, the high end of the wild guesstimate of the comet at about 1.5 grams per cubic centimeter, which is about 50% more dense than solid state water or ice. Now, this highball estimate is still slightly less than the alleged density of the planetoid Pluto, which is 1.88 grams per cubic centimeter, which will be important to keep in mind in a few minutes. Now, finally, C, and this is the option I chose to use, a convenient sort of average of 1 gram per cubic centimeter to ascribe or to describe Haley's density, while the actual average is 0.76 grams per cubic centimeter, but we'll just round it up to 1 as an average, because honestly the range in estimated density of Haley's Comet could be thousands of times more or less than scientists imagine, so rounding up a bit is not going to affect the accuracy by much. We can all relate to the density of solid state water or ice, so again we'll assume that Haley's Comet is of about the same density of ice, which is well within the extremely wild tolerances of variables. And indeed, the comet very well may be exactly as dense as ice according to the best guesses pushed by theoretical physicists. Now we'll just use the easy to handle and understandable number 1 gram per cubic centimeter for the density of Haley's Comet, and the same number for ice, and still be well within the approximate realm of numerically correct, comparing the density of the comet to the density of ice to keep it simple. Now, as for the planetoid Pluto, the density of Haley's Comet might be slightly less than Pluto, assuming the highball estimate, or a very small fraction of Pluto's density, assuming the lowball estimate. Now, of course, this is all hinging on the agreement that Pluto is actually 1.88 grams per cubic centimeter in density, which cannot be tested, verified, or falsified. So again, it's exactly pseudoscience, but we'll go ahead and use these numbers for the comet and Pluto's density, since we're humoring the phenomenon logically and skeptically, assuming a heliocentric model. Now, in any case, using this density value for Pluto, it would be about double the density of frozen water and the comet. I will state one final time that I'm humoring the heliocentric model and using their values for unknown pieces of the equation, including the volume, density, velocity, and proximity to the Sun of Haley's Comet, as well as the Sun and Pluto. Now, we are also humoring the disproved theory of gravity for argument's sake. As a disclaimer, I'm not agreeing with any of these theoretical values, merely skeptically scrutinizing the heliocentric model using their very own values, focusing on the mystery of Haley's Comet as a case study into the absurdity of heliocentrism. Now, before going any further, I will admit for either a second or third time that trying to make physical extrapolations of a body in motion based on an average of wild guesses with no frame of reference other than assumption, along with the assumptions associated with the heliocentric model, it really approaches the realm of ludicrous folly. But we'll go with it just for argument's sake, as that is how we should approach a controversial topic. We should approach it skeptically, but open to considering new data. Again, the heliocentric model is the prevailing model governing our modern paradigm, so on so many levels often not recognized by our very own rational waking minds. To me, it's of vital importance to analyze all natural phenomenon objectively to fully understand the perplexing so-called universe. Amongst many other mysteries submitted to us by the natural world, the orbit of Haley's Comet is one example of a mysterious natural phenomenon which we can really only speculate upon, as the values given to us for truly unknown variables are impossible to confirm. Now, I intend to show that an orbital path such as Haley's Comet is simply not possible in the heliocentric model, based on their very own numbers and laws agreed upon by modern science. The first thing I want to do is to get a really unreliable comparison of the object's volume and density relative to that of the planetoid Pluto. Now, I've already described the gross inaccuracies attributed to the assumed density of Halleys Comet, which can't be verified, tested, or falsified, so it is by definition pseudoscience. Now, the same thing goes for Pluto, of course. In either case, we really must consider that the size and speed of the comet must be extremely disparate comparatively in the flat Earth model versus the globe Earth model, meaning in the globe Earth model, the comet must be extremely large and extremely fast, whereas in the flat Earth model, the comet would necessarily be much smaller and much slower. Now, I do not claim to have a verified, bona fide explanation for Halleys Comet. However, I find this admission favorable to making something up off the top of my head and passing it off as proven science. Again, I have my theories, but this presentation isn't necessarily about my theories just yet. It's about the impossibility of the orbital path of Halleys Comet in the heliocentric model. Now, let's consider and compare Pluto and the comet Halley. Again, at its most distant, the comet is alleged to get about 3.3 billion miles from the Sun, which is only pretty close. It's 92% of the average distance of Pluto. So there may be points when Halley's Comet is actually more distant than Pluto. Keeping in mind we're humoring the heliocentric model according to the laws of relativity, space-time, and gravity, just like good little scientism parrots. How can you possibly make sense of an object as tiny and low density as the comet allegedly is, turning around in space about 3.3 billion miles from the Sun, which is actually wrong, but we'll just go with that. What causes the comet to curve around in space and turn in the opposite direction back towards the Sun, which has already moved some 150 billion miles from the point when the two last met? Now, the knee-jerk reaction is going to be the gravity field. You don't understand relativity. It's the gravity field of the Sun. But this honestly doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Planets allegedly orbit the Sun due to a perfect balance of the centrifugal force caused by the high velocity and mass of the planet being counterbalanced by the centripetal force of the theoretical gravity of the Sun. Now, orbits rely on this constant dynamic tension, considering the vacuum of space acting as sort of a tether between the Sun and the planet, with a perfect balance of velocity and theoretical gravitational pull, which is allegedly heavily affected by proximity, volume, and density, as well as velocity. In other words, the hypothetical orbit of the Earth is caused by the Earth's velocity, mass, and proximity to the Sun, where there is a constant sort of tug of rope or dynamic relationship between the Sun and the Earth. While the Earth travels theoretically fast enough around and at the correct distance to the Sun in order to balance out or resist the centripetal tugging in force of the Sun's so-called gravitational pull. For example, if the Earth were much faster and less massive, the gravitational relationship between the Earth and the Sun would be diminished, ergo the Earth would drift further and further away from the Sun. On the other hand, if the Earth were much more massive and far slower, it would experience a greater amount of gravitational pull from the Sun. So there's a very balanced relationship between orbital bodies, which will naturally find their equilibrium based on the variables mentioned a moment ago. Now, I will humor, for argument's sake, that the comet is slung around the backside of the Sun due to theoretical gravity as the singular motive and intelligent guiding force causing the comet to accelerate to such extreme velocities and unfathomable distances into outer space along a perfect trajectory to magically return the comet back to the Sun at regular intervals, even though the Sun is supposed to have traveled over 300 billion miles since their last rendezvous. So we'll concede that the generally accepted narrative is indeed what's occurring during the comet's interorbital period or perihelion, For argument's sake, in spite of all my disagreements with gravity and orbital mechanics in general, but with that being assumed and handed over to the Globers on a silver platter, for now, my biggest issue with Halleys Comet is what exactly is causing the comet to turn around about face in space 3.3 billion miles from the nearest sun, a billion miles from the nearest planetoid, because again it is divergent from the ecliptic, during this period of aphelion. The common typical knee-jerk answer is obviously the gravity of the sun. I mean, seriously. How does that make any sense? Remember, the planet Pluto is allegedly in a constant sort of tug of rope with the centripetal force of the sun's supposed gravity. The only reason Pluto allegedly remains stable upon a singular orbital plane at a, average distance of orbit and doesn't fly off into outer space is because of the fact that Pluto is an extremely massive object. Especially compared to you or me, and certainly compared to Halleys Comet. This means the alleged gravitational pull of the Sun is sufficient to keep Pluto in orbit at such great distances. Again, if you were to decrease the volume or density of Pluto to many times less than its current size, the gravitational pull from the Sun would be far less and would even cease to exist, and the planet would no longer possess the necessary conditions to maintain its taut tether to the Sun, and its perfectly balanced cyclical orbit would be squashed. In such a case, Pluto would fail to orbit the Sun and would escape the theoretical solar system and fly off into the infinite universe that doesn't exist. Now, with all that being said, Halleys Comet is like a grain of sand compared to Pluto, and furthermore is less dense per cubic centimeter according to modern accepted science. So if you can imagine the comet coming into view from below the ecliptic, going around the sun for a couple months, accelerating to its max velocity of 144,000 miles per hour, being set on an exact course with one hell of a Hail Mary shot to maintain its perfect 75-degree offset to the orbital plane, or to the path of the sun, way off into outer space, millions of miles in the opposite direction as the velocity of the sun, nearly a billion miles offset from the ecliptic, with hardly any mass or density to work with or speak of. What exactly is pulling the grain of sand, Halleys Comet, back towards the sun 37.5 years after zipping around the sun to gain its original velocity and trajectory? In the heliocentric model, there must be some other object like the sun to propel the comet back around towards our inner solar system, right? There is no rational explanation for an object as small and distant from the sun to be compelled back towards the center of the sun's mass and somehow guide itself back to the sun another 37.5 years later, somehow propelling the comet onto the perfect course to repeat this cycle over again. To be totally honest, if such a comet could somehow find its way back towards the sun that spit it out into outer space 75 years ago, after the comet had traveled 3.3 billion miles in the opposite direction of the sun, a billion miles divergent from the sun's path around the galaxy, while the sun has traveled 150 plus billion miles over that first 37 and a half halfway point of the Halleys Comet's orbit, the sun would have traveled 150 billion miles along a great curve in the opposite direction as the comet. Then the comet has to somehow begin to find its way back towards the sun 3.3 billion miles away, while the sun is moving at 438,000 miles per hour over the next 37.5 years, or 150 plus billion more miles from the comet's aphelion, in terms of motion of the sun, of course. Plus the 3.3 billion miles Halley must travel in order to catch up with and surpass the sun's velocity without being sucked directly into the center of the sun, as you would expect if gravity was a constant tugging inward towards the central mass of a massive object. Instead, it just barely misses the sun's event horizon and is conveniently, randomly, intelligently slingshotted round the back of the sun again. Laws of inertia be damned, and we're expected to believe this is all due to the gravitational field of the sun. This is preposterous. If you think about this logically, during the portion of Halley's journey when it's just met with the sun and is setting off in its long, lonely journey, it's moving in the opposite direction as the sun. The sun is supposedly also traveling 438,000 miles per hour in one direction, and the comet is traveling 144,000 miles per hour in the opposite direction. During the next 35 years, the sun would have moved from its original point over 150 billion miles, and the comet would have moved 3.3 billion miles in the opposite direction for a total of 153.3 billion miles. Now, whatever causes the comet to return around in space is perplexing indeed, but irrelevant for this portion of the study. Whatever the case, the comet is moving at its slowest speed when it's furthest from the sun, which means it must somehow accelerate itself and race against the sun, which has a 3.3 billion mile head start. And, not to mention, the sun is traveling hundreds of times faster than the comet, even when the comet's traveling its very fastest. Now, how could the comet possibly ever catch up to the sun in 37.5 years? Remember, it took the comet 37.5 years to reach its aphelion from the sun, when it's allegedly moving its fastest and in the opposite direction of the sun. What sort of enormous propelling force and intelligent guidance would allow such a puny comet to race against the sun with such a vast head start for the sun, and when we're talking about a distance that should be 153.3 billion miles, not 3.3 billion miles, since the two objects had been traveling in opposite directions for 36 years at immense opposing velocities. You can claim and scream relativity all you want, but basic physics will always show that objects traveling in opposite directions away from one another, the distance betwixt the two will increase at a rate equal to the two speeds combined. So as the sun travels, say, right at 438,000 miles an hour, while the comet travels left at 144,000 miles an hour, then the relative speed of the two would be 582,000 miles per hour traveling apart, give or take, since the comet's plane of orbit is allegedly offset to the path of the sun, which means the comet would cover much more ground relative to the sun during the first 37.5 years, while the two objects race away from one another. In the second 37.5 years of this so-called orbit, we must accept that the comet is somehow compelled to turn around in space and accelerate, much like it did when it passed around the sun. However, there is no sun over here, right, on the outside edge of the solar system. So this doesn't make any sense, but even assuming some magical force allows the comet to turn around in space and begin racing towards the sun, we must first consider that the sun is traveling away from the comet. This means that the comet must somehow catch up to the sun, and it would need to surpass the sun. Not to mention, it would need to do so in the exact same time frame as the first 37.5 years, which is physically impossible. The reason this is physically impossible is again because during the first portion the comet has an excuse to accelerate, the sun's gravity, and the two objects are traveling away from one another, gaining distance between the two at a relative speed which is the sum of the two speeds relative to stationary spacetime. In order for this to work, we must have a logical explanation for the exponential, massive, impossible acceleration exhibited by Halleys Comet, which is extremely small, low volume, low density, and should therefore not be affected by the sun's gravity at all near the alleged distances to Pluto, yet somehow the tug of the sun's gravity towards the center of the sun from so many billions of miles away on such a relatively small piece of dust magically places the comet back on an inbound trajectory, racing against the sun, necessarily much more slowly than when it left the sun, yet somehow catches up to the sun in exactly 37.5 years, just like it did during the first half of the journey when the sun was racing away from the comet. So it took 37.5 years to do this, and it took 37.5 years to do this. None of this crap makes any sense if you actually think about it. The behavior of Halleys Comet is not properly explained or described by gravity in the heliocentric model. The physical model used to show how comets and other orbital bodies like so-called planets, and especially third-generation satellite orbital bodies such as the LISS or the Moon, are so far beyond the realm of possibility, it truly is ridiculous to even humor them as theoretically possible. Now, I don't claim to have a scientific explanation for Halleys Comet in the flat Earth model, but I do have some theories. The point of this video was to show how preposterous the conventional explanation for, specifically Halleys Comet, is. It isn't necessary for me to have a complete and total demonstrable explanation for comets. That isn't necessary. Were this a court of law, the theory of the plaintiff or the globe Earth would have been shown to have well beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt. In fact, the amount of doubt Halleys Comet casts upon the heliocentric model is just one more piece to this ridiculous puzzle, which when completed shows that the entire modern world has been fooled by a great deception, and we must look at alternative theorem and models in light of all the evidence contrary to the religion of scientism, globe idol worship, which can no longer be ignored. The truth is everlasting, but a deception will always fall apart by nature. But the return of a relatively small body such as Halleys Comet from a distance as mind-boggling as 3.3 billion miles, this puny little object should technically exit the solar system due to the utter lack of gravitational pull from the sun at that distance, given the volume and density of the object. Even assuming the gravitational pull of the sun could pull such a small distant object back towards the center of the sun's mass, the comet should technically be headed straight for the center of the sun and should crash directly into it on its way back. Instead, we see the remarkable occurrence of the comet making this bizarre, almost, miraculous cycle, traversing our so-called inner solar system once every 75 years, maintaining its single plane of orbit, conveniently missing the ever-sucking sun once every 75 years, and not to mention maintaining its single plane of orbit, conveniently missing the ever-sucking sun by the perfect amount to reset the cycle over again. There really is no coherent explanation for the phenomenon in the heliocentric model, other than the general lack of understanding of the theory of gravity and the general inability to consider the notion that the heliocentric model, gravity, and space-time do not exist, and that the Earth is a stationary plane with millions of mysteries out there to rediscover, one of which should certainly focus on comets. Well, It seems that this video that I planned to be about 30 minutes is going to turn out to be more like an hour or so, so I'll plan to dive deeper into my theories about comets in future videos. For now, I want to thank all y'all out there for your time. I hope this has been helpful and informative. Should you like to contribute to this channel, you can do so via PayPal to jonelance@gmail.com, or you can, if you don't like PayPal, you can use fan funding right on my YouTube homepage. That's on TheMorgile. As always, your support is not expected or mandatory, but if you feel that my research and videos help to make a difference, then feel free to contribute whatever you feel that it's worth. Of course, this material is free for all to view and share and download and do whatever you want with. But if you feel like it's helped you or someone that you know and you feel that it has value, then feel free to contribute to help me, keep on trucking. Real quickly, I wanted to give a shout out and a big thanks to Ellen Ann, as I was not able to email you and thank you for your contribution that you sent via PayPal last week. There was no return email address, so I just wanted to thank you for that very much. It really means a lot to me, so God bless you for that. And finally, if you do want to support the Morgile channel, if you want to support our videos but you don't have the money, it really is the thought that counts, so no worries. I appreciate your support and encouragement all the same. It means a lot to me. God bless you all. Don't forget to check out SOGSS, that's SOGS.com, if you'd like to tithe to a Christian orphanage in Pakistan. With that, thanks so much for your time and interest. I apologize if I failed to get to everyone's comments and emails. I want you all to know that I'm not ignoring you. I just have so little time in a day. It's really all I can do to work, eat, sleep, and make videos, rinse and repeat. Between all that, I do try to stay in touch with as many of my viewers and subscribers as possible. Y'all are the best. Don't forget to hang out with us live on the Globebusters on Sundays at 3 p.m. Eastern. And finally, make sure that you're still subscribed, as a bunch of my subscribers complained that they were unsubscribed from my channel, that they weren't getting my video notification feeds. So just check my channel out, make sure you're subscribed, maybe check for some videos that you weren't aware of, because I got a rash of complaints that seemed like, I don't know, my videos were not being promoted to my subscribers. So at any rate, thanks so much. God bless y'all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace. What's up, everybody? John TheMorgile here, clocking in for another cosmological neutering session. Indeed, I have a strong aversion to massive imaginary balls. This video was intended to be relatively brief, but you know me, it covers a topic which remains a mystery to science, even though they hate to admit it. My original draft was going to be about 30 minutes, but I had to add some backstory or fundamental premises, or describe some fundamental premises for people to understand before proceeding with the, crux of the presentation or study, whatever you want to call it. This video is intended to be a comparative examination of a particular astronomical phenomenon, specifically the 75-year cycle of Halleys Comet, and how this observable anomaly of the heavens doesn't make any sense whatsoever when humoring the heliocentric model. Just as a really odd side note to kick off this show, I remember growing up, the comet was pronounced by everybody as Halleys Comet, However, the current accepted pronunciation is to be said like valleys, which only certain people can remember that part of it, which is kind of freaky, kind of weird to think about. But anyway, this video is about science, not a conspiracy theory, but I just want to throw that out there because something like the Mandela effect is attractive and intriguing to the adventurous mind. Given a 0.1% chance of time travel being invented at any point in the future, then time travel would necessarily technically exist throughout the whole of time, and minor changes in the past could result in major changes in the future instantaneously without anyone really noticing it. My only problem with the Mandela effect theory is the fact that all of the instances appear to be minor changes in the scripts of movies and other such bubblegum pop culture sort of trivial media. For a final point on this before we get back on point, if I could travel through time, I would give myself the winning numbers to the Powerball jackpot for a certain day when someone was going to lose anyway, so that nobody's harmed by my action. I would do this one single time and then hide the time machine where it could never be found, perhaps even destroy it, as it's too frightening a thing to think of what would happen were humanity to actually be able to travel back in time to change the past. If such a technology did exist at any point in the future, again, it would necessarily exist in the present and the past, and we'd suddenly see a world full of never-ending cities, McDonald's everywhere, or like a super police state where every restaurant is called Taco Bell, kind of like in that Stallone Snipes movie Demolition Man.
And my reward is dinner and dancing at Taco Bell. I mean, hey, I like Mexican food, but come on.
Your tone is quasi-facetious, but...
Sorry, globbers. Many globbers will claim that comets somehow prove a heliocentric cosmology, while the phenomenon is truly not explained adequately by mainstream science using the accepted model with gravity as the sort of prevailing force, in the whole thing. Halleys Comet is probably the most well-known of all, and many of us watching this video, and me personally, had a chance to witness Halleys Comet in our lifetimes. I was about 4 years old when it last came through our realm, so I very vaguely remember my parents bringing me out to see it when I was really young. It certainly was not as exciting or memorable as, say, when I was 3, the 4th of July, or when I was 4, the 4th of July, in terms of dazzling eye candy, but I suppose it's difficult for a toddler to appreciate the occurrence of a phenomenon that only occurs once every 75 years, and is sort of a scientific mystery, really. Now, given the electromagnetic realm that we truly live in, it's no surprise to me to see cyclical heavenly anomalies which seem to mystify scientists and stargazers, theoretical physics, and even some actual scientists. Now, for Halleys Comet to come and go in such bizarre, confounding, extremely elliptical orbital patterns like clockwork, the explanations are inadequate at best in the heliocentric model, the exposure of which is the primary focus of this video. Now, I don't claim to have a demonstrable, verifiable explanation for the phenomenon of comets, but again, neither does the heliocentric model, comet, so like Halleys Comet. Furthermore, there are accounts that the last name of the dude was actually pronounced Hawley by the man himself. Sadly, he has no living descendants or relatives to confirm the actual pronunciation of his name, and audio recordings wouldn't have been invented for another 100+ years after Edmund Haley's death. Now, I'm not a believer in the so-called Mandela effect, starting with Mandela himself, going across the board to everything except for one, which was the Luke, I am your father bit from Star Wars. I seem to remember one of my anal retentive teachers telling me in the past that everyone mispronounces Halleys Comet, but I can't swear to that. It seems like just a very vague memory. So for anyone out there who is into the Mandela effect, as it is interesting whether or not it's true, although were it true, it would of course be far more interesting. But this may be another one for proponents of the Mandela effect theory that you could, poll people on, is the pronunciation of the comet that comes around every 75 years. Last came in 1985. Is it Halleys or Halleys or Halleys Comet? I always thought it was Halleys, but anyway, I wasn't born until the 80s, and I do remember growing up that tons of celebrities tried for decades to get Mandela freed, and I clearly remember him being freed from prison in 1990, as I was 9 years old and it was on the news for weeks. Everyone I know remembers that he got freed after decades as an old man, and people are now claiming that he was actually killed in some other alternate universe timeline or whatever.
But you do not realize that Taco Bell was the only restaurant to survive the franchise wars.
So?
So? Now all restaurants are Taco Bell.
No way.
The only difference is we would not have any recollection of the previous history, since every moment in history leading up to that point before our birth would have changed, along with everyone's memories of the events. So I suppose I'm suggesting that even if the Mandela effect were a real thing, we'd never know it, and people would have no possible way of remembering alternate pasts. And I really don't see George Lucas traveling back in time to rewrite the father and son moment for Vader and Luke, so it must have been a mass misunderstanding of James Earl Jones. I mean, he was wearing a mask, although he does have one of the most, resounding, understandable voices ever. But really, if you had the time machine, why would you go back and change trivial, insignificant things like the spelling of Berenstain Bears, for example? Anyway, just thought it was an interesting side note. I'm going to call it Halleys Comet. If you want to correct me and call it Halleys Comet or Halley's Comet, go right ahead. I'm going to call it Halleys Comet. But the topic of comets comes up occasionally on different flat Earth, round Earth, globe Earth conversations, and it's often used as a proof somehow of a spherical Earth. So it's important to understand how they are explained, or comets are explained by mainstream physics, and compare that to a realistic view of the universe, which is of course a central stationary flat Earth as the primary dominant central body of the known universe, not a heliocentric universe.